It was a warm Tuesday afternoon in the peaceful suburban neighborhood of Oak Ridge Heights. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of the two-story homes that lined Maple Street. Marcus Johnson, a tall, lean 16-year-old with bright brown eyes and a winning smile, was walking home from basketball practice, his blue and white Kingston High School gym bag slung over his shoulder. Marcus had been taking this shortcut through Oak Ridge Heights for the past 2 years. It saved him 15 minutes on his walk home, and he usually enjoyed looking at the beautiful gardens and friendly dogs that would sometimes greet him from behind their fences. Today, he was especially tired after an intense practice session. Coach Williams had worked the team hard since they had a big game coming up on Friday. As he walked past house number 427, Marcus didn't notice the woman watching him from behind her expensive curtains. Karen Reynolds, a 45-year-old resident who had moved to the neighborhood just 6 months ago, had been organizing her living room when she spotted Marcus through her large bay window. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the young black teen walking down her street. Karen had always taken pride in what she called maintaining neighborhood standards. She was the type of person who complained about unmowed lawns at community meetings and started neighborhood watch groups that nobody had asked for. Her previous neighborhood had gone downhill, as she'd often told anyone who would listen, which was why she had moved to Oak Ridge Heights, a place she believed was more suitable for her lifestyle. Marcus pulled out his phone to check a text message from his mom, Mayor Diana Johnson, asking if he would pick up some milk on his way home. He smiled, thinking about how his mother somehow managed to run an entire city but still remembered the little things like restocking the fridge. He was about to reply when he heard the distinct sound of a door opening behind him. "Excuse me." Karen's sharp voice cut through the peaceful afternoon air. "What do you think you're doing here?" Marcus turned around, his hand still holding his phone. He saw a middle-aged white woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive-looking cardigan, standing with her arms crossed on her front porch. He had been raised to be polite, so despite the woman's hostile tone, he gave her his usual friendly smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Marcus responded politely, adjusting his school basketball jacket. "I'm just walking home from practice." Karen's eyes darted from Marcus's face to his gym bag, then to his phone, her expression growing more suspicious by the second. "This is a private neighborhood," she said, her voice getting louder. "I haven't seen you around here before." Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly, but he kept his composure. Something his mother had taught him was crucial in situations like this. "I actually pass through here almost every day after practice, ma'am. I live just on the other side of Cedar Street." "A likely story," Karen scoffed, pulling out her iPhone from her cardigan pocket. "Well, we'll just let the police sort this out. They can verify if you really live where you say you do." Marcus's stomach dropped, but he remained outwardly calm. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, and his parents had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pressed the record button on his phone's camera app. Another lesson his mother had taught him. "Ma'am, I don't think that's necessary," Marcus said calmly, making sure to keep his hands visible. "I'm just trying to get home." But Karen was already dialing, her fingers jabbing at her phone screen with determination. "Hello, police?" She spoke into the phone, her eyes never leaving Marcus. "Yes, I need to report a suspicious person in Oak Ridge Heights. There's a young man who doesn't belong here, and he's loitering in front of my house." As Karen continued to describe him to the police, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, and sadness. But mostly, he felt tired. Tired of having to prove he belonged somewhere. Tired of having his simple existence questioned. Still, he stood his ground, kept recording, and waited for what would come next. What neither Karen nor Marcus knew at that moment was that this incident would soon become much bigger than either of them anticipated, and it would spark a conversation that would change their community forever. The tension in the air grew thicker as Karen Reynolds paced back and forth on her front porch, still on the phone with the police. Marcus Johnson stood calmly on the sidewalk, his phone steady in his hand as he continued recording. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, and a few curious neighbors began peeking through their windows at the unfolding scene. "Yes, he's still here," Karen said into her phone, her voice growing more agitated. "He's got a bag with him, and he's recording me. This is harassment." She had completely ignored the fact that she was the one who had confronted Marcus in the first place. Marcus took a deep breath, remembering the conversations he'd had with his parents about situations like this. His father, a civil rights attorney, had always told him, stay calm, stay visible, and stay recording. His mother, Mayor Diana Johnson, had taught him that his dignity was not up for debate. A couple walking their dog on the other side of the street slowed down to watch. The husband, Mr. Thompson, who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, recognized Marcus from community events. He whispered something to his wife, and they crossed the street, approaching the scene. Is everything okay here? Mr. Thompson asked, looking between Karen and Marcus. Hey Marcus, how was basketball practice? Karen's eyes widened in surprise. You know him? She asked sharply, momentarily moving the phone away from her ear. Of course we know Marcus, Mrs. Thompson replied kindly. He's Diana's son. They've been part of this community longer than most of us. She turned to Marcus with a concerned look. Is everything all right, dear? Before Marcus could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. 2 police cars pulled up to the scene, their lights flashing but sirens now silent. Officers Williams and Rodriguez stepped out of the first car, while Officers Chen and Martinez emerged from the second. Karen immediately rushed down her porch steps, waving her arms. Officers, I'm the one who called. This young man has been loitering and refusing to leave. Officer Williams, a veteran cop with 15 years of experience, took in the scene before him. He noticed Marcus's school basketball jacket, the recording phone in his hand, and the Thompsons standing nearby. Most importantly, he recognized Marcus from the numerous community events where Mayor Johnson had spoken. Good afternoon, everyone, Officer Williams said professionally. Marcus, you doing okay? Karen's mouth fell open in shock. You know him too? Ma'am, most of us in the community know Marcus, Officer Rodriguez explained calmly. He's been living here and attending Kingston High School for years. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice steady. Officers, I was just walking home from basketball practice, taking my usual route, when Mrs. Reynolds here confronted me and called the police. I've recorded our entire interaction. He gestured to his phone, which was still recording. Officer Chen walked over to Karen, who was now looking less certain of herself. Ma'am, can you explain what made you call the police today? Karen's confidence began to falter. Well, I saw them walking through the neighborhood, and he looked suspicious. I'd never seen him before, and I was concerned about safety. What exactly looked suspicious to you? Officer Martinez asked, his notebook out. Was he doing anything specific that worried you? Karen struggled to find words. He was just walking, with a bag. Just then, another car turned onto the street, a sleek black SUV with government plates. The Thompsons exchanged knowing looks. Marcus maintained his composed expression, but a slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He knew exactly who was arriving. The SUV pulled up behind the police cars, and Mayor Diana Johnson stepped out, still wearing her business suit from a day of city meetings. Her presence commanded immediate attention, and Karen's face went pale as realization began to dawn on her. The situation had just taken a turn that Karen Reynolds hadn't expected, and the next few moments would become a turning point not just for her, but for the entire community. The simple act of walking home from basketball practice was about to spark a conversation that Oak Ridge Heights needed to have. Mayor Diana Johnson stepped out of her SUV with the grace and authority that had earned her 2 terms in office. At 45 years old, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her dark suit perfectly pressed despite her long day at City Hall. The evening air grew still as she surveyed the scene before her. 2 police cars with flashing lights, 4 officers, her son Marcus standing calmly with his phone, the Thompsons looking concerned, and a very pale-faced Karen Reynolds. Good evening, everyone, Mayor Johnson said, her voice clear and professional. She walked over to Marcus first, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Are you okay, honey? I'm fine, Mom, Marcus replied quietly. I got it all on video. Karen Reynolds stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The phone she had used to call the police was now hanging limply at her side. The realization that she had just called the police on the mayor's son was clearly sinking in. Mrs. Reynolds, I presume? Mayor Johnson turned to face Karen, her expression neutral but firm. I understand you had some concerns about my son walking through the neighborhood? I didn't know, Karen stammered, her face flushing red. I was just trying to protect. Protect what, exactly? Mayor Johnson asked, her voice remaining calm but carrying an edge of steel. My son has been walking this road home from basketball practice for 2 years now. He wears his school jacket, carries his gym bag, and greets the neighbors politely. What about that seemed threatening to you? Officer Williams stepped forward, clearing his throat. Mayor Johnson, we responded to a call about a suspicious person, but upon arrival, we immediately recognized Marcus. There's clearly been a misunderstanding here. Has there? Mayor Johnson raised an eyebrow. Officer Williams, how many calls have you received this year about suspicious people who just happen to be people of color walking through their own neighborhoods? The officer shifted uncomfortably, knowing the statistics all too well. More neighbors had begun to gather at a respectful distance, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording. Mrs. Reynolds, Mayor Johnson continued, our family has lived in this community for 3 generations. My father was a teacher at Kingston High School for 30 years. My husband's law office is just 2 blocks from here. Marcus was born in this city, plays on the basketball team, and volunteers at the community center every weekend. Yet you saw him walking down the street and your first instinct was to call the police. Karen's face had moved from red to almost purple. I didn't. I was just trying to be vigilant about neighborhood safety. Safety. Mayor Johnson repeated the word thoughtfully. Let's talk about safety. Do you know what it feels like to have to teach your child special rules about how to behave when someone profiles them? To tell them to always keep their hands visible, to record everything, to stay calm even when they're being treated like a criminal in their own neighborhood. The Thompsons nodded solemnly, and Mrs. Thompson wiped a tear from her eye. Even the officers looked down at their feet, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. Marcus stood tall beside his mother, still recording. He had been through this before, but never with his mother present. Watching her handle the situation with such dignity made him stand a little straighter. Officers, Mayor Johnson addressed the police. I appreciate your professional response today. But I think we all know this call should never have been made in the first place. She turned back to Karen. Mrs. Reynolds, this incident will not be forgotten, but how we move forward from it is up to you. Tomorrow morning, my office will be announcing a new community initiative to address racial profiling and bias in our neighborhoods. I invite you to be part of that conversation. Karen looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. The neighbors who had gathered were whispering among themselves, and several phones were still recording the scene. What had started as one woman's misguided attempt to protect her neighborhood had turned into a powerful moment of public education. As the sun set over Oak Ridge Heights, it was clear that this evening would mark the beginning of some difficult but necessary conversations in the community. The simple act of a teenager walking home from basketball practice had exposed a deep-rooted problem that could no longer be ignored. The next morning, the incident had already gone viral. Marcus's video, which his friend had helped upload to social media the previous evening, had gained over 100,000 views overnight. Local news vans were parked outside City Hall, their reporters preparing for Mayor Johnson's announced press conference about the new community initiative. Inside her office, Mayor Diana Johnson sat at her desk, reviewing her speech one final time. The walls around her displayed family photos, including one of young Marcus at his first basketball game and her own mother's picture from the 1960s civil rights marches. Her assistant knocked on the door. Mayor Johnson, the press is ready in the conference room, the assistant said. And Mrs. Reynolds is here too. Karen Reynolds had arrived early, looking very different from the confrontational woman of yesterday. Her designer outfit was replaced with a simple blouse and pants, and her face showed signs of a sleepless night. She sat quietly in the back of the conference room, trying to avoid the curious stares of reporters and community members. Marcus sat in the front row, wearing his school uniform. Next to him was his father, James Johnson, a respected civil rights attorney who had taken the morning off from court to be there. The Thompsons were present too, along with several other neighbors and community leaders. At exactly 10:00 a.m., Mayor Johnson walked to the podium. Camera flashes filled the room as she adjusted the microphone. Good morning, she began, her voice steady and clear. Yesterday, an incident occurred in our community that has sparked important conversations across social media. My son was racially profiled while walking home from basketball practice, resulting in a police call that should never have been made. The room was completely silent as she continued. But today, we're not here to shame or punish. We're here to learn and grow as a community. This morning, I'm announcing the creation of the Oak Ridge Heights Community Unity Initiative. Mayor Johnson outlined the program, which would include monthly community dialogues, cultural awareness training for neighborhood watch groups, and partnerships between local schools and community organizations. As she spoke, Karen Reynolds sank lower in her chair, tears forming in her eyes. And now, Mayor Johnson said, "I'd like to invite Mrs. Karen Reynolds to come forward." A collective gasp went through the room. Nobody had expected this. Karen looked startled, her face turning pale. After a moment's hesitation, she slowly stood up and walked to the podium, her legs shaking slightly. "Mrs. Reynolds approached my office this morning," Mayor Johnson explained, requesting an opportunity to address the community. Karen stood at the microphone, her hands trembling. I want to apologize," she began, her voice barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and started again. "I want to apologize to Marcus Johnson, to Mayor Johnson, and to our entire community. Yesterday, I acted on prejudices I didn't even realize I had." She turned to face Marcus directly. "I saw a young black man walking down the street, and I immediately assumed the worst. I was wrong. I didn't see a student walking home from practice. I didn't see a volunteer who helps at the community center. I didn't see someone's son. I just saw what my biases wanted me to see." Tears were now flowing freely down Karen's face. "This morning, I've enrolled in the Cultural Awareness Training program at the community center. I know an apology isn't enough, but I want to learn and do better." Marcus stood up and walked to the podium. In a moment that would later be shared thousands of times on social media, he extended his hand to Karen. She took it, her hand still shaking. "Thank you for admitting your mistake," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "That's how change begins." Mayor Johnson watched the scene unfold, pride evident in her eyes. This was more than just damage control for an unfortunate incident. This was a teaching moment, a chance for real change in their community. As reporters raised their hands to ask questions, it was clear that this story was far from over. The incident that began with a prejudiced phone call was transforming into something much more significant, a catalyst for genuine conversation and change in Oak Ridge Heights. 1 week after the press conference, the story had spread far beyond Oak Ridge Heights. National news networks picked up the video, and Mayor Johnson had received invitations to appear on several major morning shows. But rather than focus on the media attention, she chose to concentrate on making real changes in her community. The first community unity meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at the Oak Ridge Heights Community Center. The large meeting room, usually used for yoga classes and birthday parties, was now packed with over 200 residents. Chairs had been arranged in a circle rather than rows, creating an environment for open dialogue. Marcus arrived early with his parents. He noticed Karen Reynolds sitting quietly in one corner, clutching a notebook. She looked nervous but determined. Over the past week, she had received both harsh criticism and praise online. Criticism for her initial actions, but praise for her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and commit to change. "Good morning, everyone," Mayor Johnson began, standing in the center of the circle. "Today isn't about pointing fingers or dwelling on past mistakes. It's about having honest conversations about race, privilege, and community." She introduced Dr. Sarah Chen, a respected diversity and inclusion expert who would be facilitating the discussion. Dr. Chen stood up, her gentle smile putting everyone at ease. "Let's start with something simple," Dr. Chen said. "I want each person to share a moment when they felt like an outsider in their own community." The room fell silent. Then, surprising everyone, Karen Reynolds raised her hand. "May I start?" Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. "When I was 12, Karen began, her voice shaky, my family lost everything in a bankruptcy. We moved from our big house to a small apartment in a different neighborhood. The other kids made fun of my second-hand clothes. I felt judged every day." She paused, wiping her eyes. I think that's why I became so focused on protecting what I saw as my neighborhood. But I realize now that I became the very thing that once hurt me, someone who judges others without knowing their story. Marcus listened intently. He had never imagined that the woman who had called the police on him would have her own story of feeling like an outsider. It didn't excuse her actions, but it helped him understand them better. Other residents began sharing their stories. Mr. Thompson talked about being the only Asian family on his block in the 1980s. A teenage girl described being bullied for wearing a hijab at school. An elderly man spoke about facing discrimination because of his accent. When it was Marcus's turn, he stood up slowly. "What happened last week wasn't the first time someone assumed I didn't belong," he said. "But it was the first time I saw how one incident could lead to positive change. Yesterday, at basketball practice, some of my teammates shared similar experiences. We've never talked about these things before, but now we're starting to." The discussion continued for hours. People who had lived as neighbors for years were finally having real conversations about race, prejudice, and community. There were tears, uncomfortable moments, and even some laughter as people shared their stories and listened to others. Near the end of the meeting, Karen approached Marcus and his parents. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this week," she said. "I'm helping organize a basketball tournament at the community center, bringing together teams from different neighborhoods. Would you be interested in helping, Marcus?" Marcus looked at his parents, who nodded encouragingly. "I would," he replied. "And I know some other players who would want to join too." Mayor Johnson watched this exchange with satisfaction. This was what real change looked like, not just public apologies and press conferences, but people actually working together to build a better community. As people began to leave the meeting, there was a sense that something important had started. The incident that could have divided the community was instead bringing it together. Signs were being put up around the neighborhood advertising the upcoming basketball tournament, reading "One Community, Many Stories." The local news crew, who had been permitted to film parts of the meeting, captured Dr. Chen's closing words. "Change doesn't happen in one day or one meeting. It happens in small moments, in conversations like these, in people choosing to listen and learn from each other." As Marcus helped stack the chairs after the meeting, he realized that sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best changes. The Community Unity Initiative was just beginning, but its impact was already being felt throughout Oak Ridge Heights. 2 weeks after the first Community Unity meeting, Oak Ridge Heights was buzzing with activity. The community center's basketball tournament was scheduled for Saturday, and colorful posters decorated shop windows and street corners. Marcus Johnson and Karen Reynolds have been working together on the organizing committee, turning their viral moment into something positive for the neighborhood. Early Saturday morning, Marcus arrived at the community center with his team from Kingston High School. He wore his blue and white jersey proudly, number 23 glinting in the morning sun. The parking lot was already filling up with cars, and the smell of barbecue drifted from the food trucks that Karen had helped arrange. "Marcus," Karen called out, walking over with a clipboard. She looked different now, more relaxed, wearing jeans and a Community Unity Tournament t-shirt that all the volunteers were wearing. "The teams from Westside High and Roosevelt Prep just arrived. We got 8 teams total." The gymnasium had been transformed. Team banners hung from the walls, and bleachers were filled with excited families from different neighborhoods. Mayor Johnson stood near the entrance, greeting people with a warm smile. She had insisted on keeping the event community-focused, turning down offers from major news networks to cover it. "Mom," Marcus said, approaching her with a grin, "you won't believe how many people showed up." Diana Johnson looked around proudly. "This is exactly what our community needed, not just talks about unity, but actually bringing people together." The tournament began with a speech from Mr. Thompson, who had volunteered to be the main referee. "Today isn't just about basketball," he announced through the microphone. "It's about breaking down walls between neighborhoods and building bridges instead." As the games began, something magical started happening. Teams that had once seen each other as rivals were now cheering for one another between matches. Parents who might never have spoken to each other were sharing snacks in the bleachers and exchanging phone numbers. During a break between games, Karen organized a free-throw contest for the younger kids. She stood by the court, helping little ones hold the basketball correctly, her previous prejudices forgotten in the joy of the moment. Marcus watched from the sidelines, amazed at how much could change in just a few weeks. "You know," Karen said, walking over to him during a break, "my daughter's starting at Kingston High next semester. She was nervous about it, but after being part of this tournament, she's actually excited. Wait, you have a daughter? Marcus asked, surprised. Karen nodded, pointing to a teenage girl helping at the concession stand. That's Emma. We moved here after my divorce, and I think I was so scared of everything changing that I tried to control everything around me, including who I thought belonged in this neighborhood. Marcus's team made it to the finals, facing off against Roosevelt Prep. The game was intense, with both teams showing incredible skill and sportsmanship. In the final seconds, Marcus passed the ball to his teammate instead of taking the shot himself, resulting in the winning basket. The crowd erupted in cheers. But the real victory wasn't in the score. It was in seeing the teams congratulate each other afterward, exchanging phone numbers and making plans to practice together. It was in watching Karen and Emma cheering just as loudly for other teams as they did for Kingston High. It was in seeing parents from different neighborhoods planning future playdates for their kids. During the award ceremony, Mayor Johnson took the microphone. 3 weeks ago, an incident in our community could have divided us. Instead, look at what we've created together. She gestured to the packed gymnasium. This is just the beginning. Marcus stood with his team, their trophy glinting under the gymnasium lights. But he felt prouder of something else, the sight of Emma, Karen's daughter, teaching some younger kids how to dribble at the side of the court, while Karen took photos with a huge smile on her face. As the day went down and people began to leave, plans were already being made for the next tournament. The food truck owners had done so well, they were discussing making it a monthly event. Parents were organizing carpools for future practice sessions between kids from different neighborhoods. Marcus helped Karen and Emma take down the banners. Same time next month? He asked with a smile. Definitely, Karen replied, looking around at what they had built together. You know, sometimes the worst mistakes can lead to the best changes. The community center lights dimmed, but the spirit of unity that had been sparked continued to glow brightly in Oak Ridge Heights. 1 month after the successful basketball tournament, the changes in Oak Ridge Heights were visible everywhere. The story that had started with a prejudiced phone call had transformed into a movement that was catching national attention. Mayor Diana Johnson's office had received calls from other cities wanting to learn about their community unity initiative. On a sunny Wednesday afternoon, Marcus sat in his school's auditorium, nervous but excited. He had been asked to give a speech to the combined student bodies of 3 local high schools, Kingston High, Roosevelt Prep, and West Side High. Over 1,000 students filled the seats, and among them sat Karen Reynolds and her daughter Emma, who had just started at Kingston High last week. Principal Martinez stepped up to the microphone. Today, we have a special speaker. Most of you know Marcus Johnson from our basketball team, or maybe from the viral video that sparked important changes in our community. But today, he's here to talk about something bigger than that incident. Marcus walked to the podium, wearing his school blazer. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was steady as he began to speak. A month ago, someone called the police on me because they thought I didn't belong in my own neighborhood. He started. But instead of letting that moment divide us, our community chose to grow from it. He looked at Karen, who gave him an encouraging nod. Mrs. Reynolds, the person who made that call, could have hidden away after the video went viral. Instead, she stood up, admitted her mistakes, and worked to make things better. That taught me something important. We all make mistakes, but it's what we do afterward that defines us. Marcus then shared stories from the basketball tournament, the new friendships formed, and the changes he'd seen in the community. He talked about Emma making friends on her first day at Kingston High because students recognized her from the tournament. He described how the monthly community dinners now had waiting lists because so many families wanted to join. But we still have work to do, Marcus continued. That's why today, we're launching the Student Unity Council. Representatives from all 3 schools will work together on community projects, sports events, and cultural celebrations. And yes, there will be more basketball tournaments. The audience erupted in cheers. Principal Martinez returned to the microphone to announce that Karen Reynolds would be one of the adult advisors for the council, working alongside teachers from each school. After the assembly, students crowded around the sign-up tables for the Student Unity Council. Marcus watched as Emma confidently chatted with a group of girls from different schools, no longer the nervous new student. Karen approached Marcus, holding a letter. I wanted you to see this first, she said, handing it to him. It's being published in tomorrow's newspaper. Marcus opened the letter and read. Dear community, a month ago, I made a terrible mistake born from prejudice and fear. But through the grace and wisdom of the Johnson family and our entire community, that mistake became an opportunity for growth. Today, I'm not just sorry for what I did, I'm grateful for how our community responded. My daughter and I have found a real home here, not because we're keeping people out, but because everyone is welcomed in. Karen Reynolds. Marcus smiled as he finished reading. This is really good, Mrs. Reynolds. Please call me Karen, she said, smiling back. Oh, and don't forget, the Community Center Board meeting is tomorrow. We're voting on expanding the youth programs. Mayor Johnson, who had been watching the assembly from the back, joined them. I just got a call from the City Council, she said. They've unanimously approved funding for the Community Unity Initiative to continue for the next 5 years. As students filtered out of the auditorium, Marcus noticed something remarkable. The usual cliques and divided groups were gone. Students from all 3 schools were mixing, laughing, and making plans together. A boy in a Roosevelt Prep uniform was teaching a Kingston High student how to use his camera. A group of girls from Westside High were singing with Emma and her new friends. Principal Martinez approached the small group. You know, he said thoughtfully, when I first heard about the incident, I worried it would divide our community. Instead, it's brought us closer than ever. Marcus looked around at the scene. Karen and his mother chatting like old friends, Emma surrounded by new friends, students from different schools planning the next Unity event. The worst moment of his life had somehow turned into something beautiful. As the afternoon sun streamed through the auditorium windows, Marcus realized that real change wasn't just about big gestures or viral videos. It was about people choosing, day after day, to do better, to learn from mistakes, and to build something positive together. 6 months had passed since the incident that changed Oak Ridge Heights forever. On a beautiful spring evening, the community gathered in the city park for a special celebration. Strings of lights hung between trees, food trucks lined the pathways, and a temporary stage had been set up near the fountain. Marcus Johnson stood at the edge of the crowd, taking it all in. He was now wearing his new Student Unity Council president pin on his jacket, having been elected by students from all 3 high schools. Next to him, Emma Reynolds was adjusting her camera, preparing to document the evening for the community newsletter she had started. Can you believe it's been 6 months? Emma asked, snapping a photo of children playing together on the grass. Mom says she hardly recognizes the neighborhood anymore, in a good way. Karen Reynolds was busy directing volunteers at the welcome table, wearing her Community Unity t-shirt with pride. The scared, angry woman who had called the police on Marcus that day was gone, replaced by someone who had become one of the community's most active volunteers. Mayor Diana Johnson took the stage, tapping the microphone gently. Good evening, Oak Ridge Heights, she began, smiling at the diverse crowd before her. 6 months ago, our community faced a moment that could have torn us apart. Instead, it brought us together in ways we never imagined. She gestured to a large board displayed near the stage, filled with photographs and newspaper clippings. Look at what we've accomplished: 3 successful Unity basketball tournaments, weekly community dinners with waiting lists, a student exchange program between our 3 high schools, cultural celebration days, and most importantly, real friendships that cross all the lines that once divided us. The crowd applauded as Mayor Johnson continued. Tonight, I'm proud to announce that 5 other cities have adopted our Community Unity Initiative. What started here in Oak Ridge Heights is spreading across the country. Marcus watched as Karen made her way through the crowd to stand beside him and Emma. You know, she said quietly, I used to think I was protecting my neighborhood by keeping people out. Now I realize that real protection comes from bringing people together. The evening's program began with performances from students of all 3 high schools. The Kingston High basketball team, wearing their championship medals from the latest Unity tournament, did a synchronized dance routine that had everyone laughing and cheering. Emma's photography club presented a slideshow of community moments from the past 6 months. Then came the surprise of the evening. Mr. Thompson took the stage and announced, thanks to a grant from the City Council and donations from our community, the Oak Ridge Heights Community Center will be expanding. We're adding a new youth center, and the board has voted to name it the Johnson Reynolds Unity Center in honor of the two families who turned a moment of conflict into a movement of change. Both Marcus and Karen looked stunned. Mayor Johnson smiled from the stage, having kept this secret from her son. Emma squealed with delight, taking photos of everyone's reactions. The celebration continued into the evening. Food was shared, stories were told, and new connections were made. Children who would have never met 6 months ago played together on the grass. Teenagers from different schools sat in circles, planning future events. Parents exchanged recipes and phone numbers. As the sun began to set, Marcus found himself walking with Karen and Emma along the park path. They passed the spot where he used to cut through the neighborhood, where Karen had once called the police on him. "I walk this path every day now," Emma said, "and every time I think about how one moment changed everything." Karen put her arm around her daughter. "Sometimes our worst mistakes can lead to our best moments, if we're brave enough to learn from them." Marcus nodded, and sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a beginning. They reached the community bulletin board, now covered with flyers for upcoming Unity events, basketball tournaments, cultural festivals, community dinners, and student exchange programs. At the center was a new poster that read, "Oak Ridge Heights, one community, many stories, all welcome." Mayor Johnson joined them, holding a stack of papers. "The governor just called," she said excitedly. "They want to make our Unity initiative a statewide program. They're asking us to help train other communities." As the lights twinkled in the trees above them, Marcus looked around at his transformed community. The incident that could have left him feeling unwelcome in his own neighborhood had instead created a place where everyone felt they belonged. The story that began with a prejudiced phone call had become a lesson in transformation, proving that when people choose understanding over fear and unity over division, real change is possible. Oak Ridge Heights had become more than just a neighborhood. It was now a model for communities everywhere.